Hello there, I'm Dr. Kirsten James Dunn, and this is Museum Studies. So this is our landing page, and if you took the navigational uh, tour, which actually is going to be over here, we're still in that stage. I just finished it. I'll be posting it there soon. Then you know that over here in our navigational panel, you'll find Unit 1. So in Unit 1, we have a number of resources. This video I am filming right now is going to go right here with this placeholder. We have course overview and navigation. Move over here. We have our to-do list. We have readings and handouts. We have questions for discussion. We have the timeline for here. We have symposia assignments. We have a couple of initial videos, which will probably be a part of our classroom work. We have another timeline here. We have a who's who, an initial who's who of museum studies. Back over here on our to-do list side, our right side of the screen, we have the to-do list, readings and handouts, symposia assignments, and I've already started working those out. If it's some of you will be working together on certain subjects, but I don't want to talk about that right now. I don't want to talk about the specifics of the research project right now. We'll go over that in a separate interview. This is just an initial overview, but the important thing to know is that you will be working with others on a research project, and that project will form a part of a symposium. And those symposiums, and there will be several of them, will come together as a symposia session, a collection of symposium. And our specific discussion will take some particular feature of heritage, for instance, the labyrinth, and we'll discuss that part of heritage from different perspectives, what it means in the landscape, and how we can think of heritage itself, in a sense, as a museum, including outdoors and the indoors. We're getting ahead of ourselves. That's going to form a part of our work in this course. Uh, every unit has supplemental videos as well, and some of these we will watch together in class. But things we don't get to, you are going to need to watch outside of class. So this is part of your homework. You don't have a textbook, but we do have readings and we do have a lot of videos generally that we review. Guest speakers, if you will. I'm scrolling back up the page because in this particular unit, you'll notice there's a basic vocabulary for museum studies. And there's also this article from 1971 about the museum, temple, or the forum. Now, we'll probably be reading this together, so it won't necessarily be as arduous a task as you might think. But I want you to be aware of the fact that readings will be within the to-do list and readings will also be in the handouts. And there may actually be more than just that by the time we start our course at the beginning of next term. All right, so the questions we're going to initially discuss in this have to do with what is a museum, defining our terms. For those of you who've had me in philosophy, what is the Socratic method? First of all, what do you mean by that? And then what's your evidence for that? So in coming up with our definition for a museum, we'll think about different types of definitions. And for some of you, that might be bring back memories from our philosophy course as well. Now, the next question is the Euro-Western colonialist tradition and museum practices socially just historically? I think most of us, without even knowing anything about museum studies, could probably answer no. There's almost nothing about the colonialist tradition that is especially socially just, at least in my opinion and in the opinion of many others. All right. Are there traditional colonialist museums, or rather, are traditional colonialist museums still relevant? Okay, we'll talk about that. What is the difference between an installation and a museum? question. And what is an object? We talked a bit about that in philosophy. We're going to talk about that more in museology. What is the difference between a cabinet of curiosities and a portmanteau? Okay, we're going to look at that too. We're also going to introduce Catalogit. Now, Catalogit is a database system that we're using to form the basis of our museum's database. And I think it's going to be a pretty exciting process. So we'll get a little into that, but that's primarily going to be more coming into Unit 2 when we talk about museum collections and management. We'll get a little bit into that. So let's look at our first timeline over here. So again, we have a short, why do we have museums? It's made for kids, but I think it's a pretty entertaining little video. So we'll start there. And then brilliant scholar and lecturer Dr. Danielle Banbridge asks, are museums ethical in her Origins series? It's an excellent video, and I look forward to our discussion of it. We have a general timeline of museum practices. Before I go in there, I think I want to continue on the video tract. We're going to talk about or watch Wondrous Obsessions Part 1 and 2. Now, these are a discussion of cabinets of curiosity. We'll get more into that in the course. We're also going to look at something old, Duchamp's Le Boîte en Valise, his little portable museums. There's a tradition of portable museums that we'll be discussing. Something new, democratizing access to museums and museums in the environment and climate change. We're going to look at something borrowed or stolen, which is the tradition in colonialism of basically stealing things from other countries and also how colonialism and that mindset has influenced the development of museums in the Euro-Western tradition and how we decolonize them. So we're going to look at a video about that. We're going to look at the controversy over the Parthenon marbles. Here it's saying the Elgin marbles, which is in itself an affront for those of us who are on Greece's side with the Parthenon marbles. We're going to look at that. And then we also look at this recent story, which is one of the most recent things that has happened. And this is December 2023 at the time I'm doing this. Probably it might be seeming a little bit old hat in the future, but will, I think, always be a good expression of the conflict between the nation of Greece and the United Kingdom on the subject of antiquities and stolen antiquities as in most specific sense. And then something blue, a little discussion, a 3-year labor of love of the conservation and keep and reinstallation of the blue whale. And in case you didn't know, this is one of those iconic, what we'll call iconic artifacts in a museum that tends to be something that generations have a relationship with. We have relationships with objects. I mean, most of us have an immediate relationship, for example, with our mobile phone. But in museums, there are certain objects that for the community that visit that museum become iconic, become something that they saw as a child with a parent or grandparent, and then they take their children or their grandchildren to see. So it's a point of reference for many. And I think when we look at our class, we'll also be broadening that to talk about connection to a place, how there are different cultural relationships to environment and to, again, what we objectify in our lives. All right, getting a little ahead of ourselves again, but that's going to form part of our discussion. Now, we have, as I said, a little bit of a timeline. Now, in the 17th, 16th, and 17th century, there's an emergence of private cabinets of curiosities, often associated with wealthy aristocrats, scholars, and merchants. And that's something what we're going to be talking about or listening about in Wondrous Obsessions. Um, these collections housed a diverse range of objects, usually including natural specimens, artifacts, works of arts, and exotic items from around the world. These were talking points. So the wealthy would go on tours and they bring back souvenirs, essentially. They bring back things from other places, or they buy things or have things procured. And they were something that was interesting to talk about, something they could share with others that also showed, obviously, their wealth. They were used for educational purposes, but also and show off, if you will, to uh, also entertain. So they did many things, and therefore sort of form a basis. Now we say cabinets of curiosity, but really many of these cabinets were actually rooms of curiosity for the very wealthy. Could also be smaller. So now let's cabinets of curiosity reflected the growing interest in exploration, scientific inquiry, and the expansion of European empires. So in a sense, you can look at the development of museums and from the origin of private cabinets of curiosity as an expression of colonialism, of imperialism, of sort of the geopolitical state of the world at various times. Okay, let's go to the 18th century. Transformation of private cabinets of curiosity into public museums driven by Enlightenment ideals of education and public enlightenment or enrichment. The establishment of natural museums, or rather national museums, such as the British Museum in London in 1753 and the Louvre Museum in Paris in 1793, were places to house and display vast collections of artifacts and artworks. Mhm. These places began as sort of limited but public access, and then over time have become places that just everyone can come and do. For example, the British Museum is still free. You do not pay admission, which is different. The tradition of European museums in which you don't pay to get in because considered an obligation on the part of the government to provide for public education and enrichment. That notion, European notion, and the idea of the National Museum has not carried over so much into the United States. The United States requires us to pay to get into most museums. So the concept of free national museums is a very European concept, and I think it's probably partly due to the notion of noblesse oblige, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So the emphasis on classification, cataloging, and scientific study of museum objects reflecting the rise in modern science and taxonomy takes place during this time period in the 18th century, really transitioning into the 19th century when we see a continued growth and expansion of museums, along with the continued growth and expansion of European empires and colonialism, but with a focus on acquiring and displaying, again, objects from these colonized territories. Uh, so it's partly, it is not just partly, it is there to inform the public of the power of the government and the expansiveness of their dominance in the world. Um, Emergence of anthropology and ethnography as academic disciplines leading to the collection and display of cultural artifacts around the world happens due to this. And there is a development during this time period of the concept of the Universal Museum, aiming to represent the entirety of human history and culture within a single institution. There's some significant downsides. It sounds like a good idea initially, this Universal Museum, but there's some issues. There's some problematic issues with it. We will be discussing those more in depth in our course. During the 20th century, we have an increasing critique of museums' colonialist practices. Getting into the 20th century, some important questions begin to be raised and asked about the Eurocentric framing of collections. And by Eurocentric, I mean that the approach to display, the things that are on display, the provenance of the things on display, what that means, the relationships that are formed in the world and between societies and cultures based on this, all of those questions become highly relevant and are discussed during those times. Um, in the 20th century, we see an emergence of new movements for the decolonization and repatriation of cultural artifacts to their countries of origin. We see a rise of new museological approaches that emphasize cultural diversity of artifacts and of community engagement and of interactive experiences. In the 21st century, so not so much time has passed so much, but we are coming up to the first quarter of century mark. So during the 21st century so far, we have continued debates about the role of museums in addressing issues of colonialism, repatriation, and cultural representation. We start embracing digital technologies to expand museums, also the access and engagement of these museums and collections to include online exhibitions, virtual tours, and social media platforms. These things kind of extend the ability of a museum to provide for audiences. Exploration of alternative museum models are also going on, such as community-based museums, pop-up exhibitions, and all of these things, they really do challenge traditional museum structures. And again, we're also going to think about what constitutes a museum per se. What constitutes a collection? What does that mean? All right. Um, Our overall symposium or symposia idea is that of a museum without walls. So our symposia research is all centered around that, and each symposium takes on a perspective for discussion on that. All right, so let's change for a moment away from the timeline of that nature and look at some major museums theory and practice contributors. Sort of a initial who's who of museum studies. So Marc Auger. I've included Marc Auger because I did a great deal of work in my master's degree level with Marc Auger because I am interested in the notion of rhetorical spaces. What's the difference between place and space? I am interested in the notion of museums without walls. And Marc Auger was a French anthropologist known for his work in what we call non-places and modernity. His publication, Non-Places Introduction to an Anthropology of Modernity, is a fascinating read, at least it was to me. And we'll look a little bit at his work in this notion of places of waiting and transition. Why is this important? Well, essentially, the concept is that we create place out of space, that we define a space and then it becomes a place. So a museum, which we look at as a museum, is usually highly informed by culture, highly informed by our socialization, how we've been educated. We identify it as such, and then we treat it in a certain way and behave in a certain way based upon that enculturation, that socialization. So, what then about transitional spaces? Well, transitional spaces are places like if we were in a place that had public transit when you're on a bus or you're a passenger in a car or you're taking a train somewhere or a plane or you're in a waiting room, you're in between places. Those spaces aren't as well defined for purpose as others. Now, because of the internet, because of our mobile phones, which are like mobile offices, suddenly what used to be in previous centuries, um, ill-defined and therefore kind of open spaces are now places. They're not simply whatever you would have them be. They're not this in-between land of being. They are defined by whatever work responsibilities we may have, for example, or social responsibilities that we might have. So Marc Auger looked a lot at that. Now, Tony Bennett was a British academic whose work has critically examined the historical development of museums. His uh, main publication that many look to, or immediate one that many think of, is The Birth of the Museum: History, Theory, and Politics. And that might contribute a bit to our discussion of context. Graham Black's biography is that he's written on the changing nature of museum experiences in the digital age. and audience engagement. Now, this is back from 2012, so sort of when I was doing a lot of initial work on the subject of digital museums and such. It was very exciting, some of what he was writing about. So he's got transforming museums in the 21st century. It might, if I select some readings from there, they might seem a little bit dated, but we might be looking at his work now. This one is a little bit more immediate. We're going to be reading The Museum, a Temple, or The Forum by Duncan F. Cameron, because he was an extremely foundational member of the museum's community. And he's a Canadian museums professional known for his influential ideas on the role of museums in society. So we'll be looking at his article. John Cotton Dana. Well, right. He's an American librarian, museum reformer. Dana advocated for public access in libraries and museums, emphasizing their roles in community engagement and education. And we might take a glance at his The New Museum from 1917. So I love doing that because we have to remember that everything we consider new at the moment is going to eventually not be new. But it will be interesting to look at some of his ideas and see if, in spite of the work being very dated, see what we can gather from the as a impetus or motivation that continues regardless. Just as when we look at Cameron's work from 1971, we'll see that a lot of what he has to say is still relevant to our discussion of what a museum is and what we intend to do in that context these days. All right. Foucault, Michel Foucault. Um, he was a highly influential French philosopher. His ideas on what are called heterotopias have been influential in museum studies. And so we will definitely be looking at of other spaces, utopias and heterotopias, and think about how those impact our understanding of the museum experience. George Brown Goody, Assistant Secretary in charge of the United States National Museum, Smithsonian Institution from 1897 to 1896. The Principles of Museum Administration, 1895. Now we're going to look at that in our next unit because it still applies, which tells you a little bit about conventional museums management. That his ideas would still apply. Plus, there's a link. He's actually referenced by Cameron and some of his ideas are referenced by another author when we're going to be looking at Han's work on Do Museums Still Need Things? And he references Good's approach to defining museums. Elaine Human-Gurian is a museum consultant known for her work on audience engagement and community involvement in museums. From 1991 to 94, she was the deputy director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She's influenced museum practices through numerous papers and lectures focusing on inclusivity and the social role of museums. And I may draw upon a few things from her Civilizing the Museum's selection of her written works. Eileen Hooper Greenhill. All right. She's one of the famous members of the University of Leicester College of Museum Studies that I went to. She's a prominent figure in museum studies, focusing on how museums communicate and their societal role. She had a very popular and famous publication in 2000, Museums and the Interpretation of Visual Culture. Andre Malraux. He is included because he's not only influential in museums, but he also formed part of my work. I admit that I do enjoy the French theorists. So Malraux was a French novelist and cultural theorist. He is known for his concept of the museum without walls. So you see, he'll be a potentially critical thing for us to draw upon. Although we will not be reading him in the original French, we'll be using translations if we read any of his work at all. But probably mostly we will just talk about his concept of the Imaginary Museum from 1947. And especially since sort of not only a discussion of museums, but is prescient of the internet, of television, of the internet, of media, and what media means. Media and the web as a concept of a kind of museum that we curate ourselves. Okay, Susan McLeod, she was the head of the department when I was at Leicester. She's a brilliant scholar. She's well known for her understanding of design and architecture and how that impacts museum experience. So she's a scholar in museum studies specializing in museum making, architecture, and design. Her publications, several of them, all brilliant. Museums and Design for Creative Lives is his most recent that I'm familiar with. Museum Architecture, a new biography from 2013. She's working on that when I was there. And then The Future of Museum and Gallery Design. That's somewhat after my time, but I think we might be drawing upon it too. Richard Sandel was on my committee, um, the committee that evaluated my work in order for me to get my PhD. Uh, he is based in the UK. His work focuses on the role of museums in addressing social issues and promoting social justice. He did a lot of work in visitor studies, but again, he's primarily interested in equity and in social justice. His work includes numerous articles and edited volumes that explore museums' potential in fostering social inclusion and change. His most recent books include Museums, Moralities, and Human Rights in 2017, Museum Activism, co-edited with Robert Janes in 2019. And then he also won the Canadian Museums Association Award for Outstanding Achievement for Research in the Cultural Sector, Heritage Sector. He's also a really incredibly kind, brilliant, generous, and all around wonderful human being. Okay, but Nina Simone, she is American and quite well known for her innovative approaches to creative and entertaining, fun museums practices. She's particularly interested in interactivity, participatory museums, and community involvement. And she, in fact, wrote the book. She wrote the book on it, the Participatory Museum in 2010. Stephen Weil was a museum scholar, deputy director of the Hirshhorn Museum, known for his writings on museum ethics and management. And we might look a little bit at his work, Making Museums Modern from 2002. Now, each of these initial movers and shakers of the museum's world, uh, incredibly influential individuals, um, they've significantly contributed to the fields of museum studies, archaeology, and cultural theory, influencing how we understand and interact with conventional museums, cultural spaces, and social narratives. And a lot of what we discuss when we're looking at museums is this notion of narrative, of story, because museums tell stories and social narrative. And the stories we tell, as we've talked about in other classes that I've taught, if you've had me in those classes before, we talk about the notion of the power of of a story, the danger of the single story, and how we need to embrace often multiple perspectives while maintaining an understandable narrative. But inclusion is our basic focus, the idea that we understand the whole of something better if we can get a few more perspectives on it. That one perspective alone is usually not enough. So, quite a bit of what we're going to be talking about in this has to do with social narrative. Right. I think you've been a wonderful audience, and we're going to go ahead and leave our discussion there for the moment. I am again making this as a general overview. We will be discussing these issues in depth and going over the readings in depth as a seminar during our class. So, our community group discussion is going to form the fabric of what we do, and it's very important to pay attention to the work in our discussions because your examination process will be based on the readings, the content in the readings, the content in these videos, but also the content in the unit, but also it's going to the exam process will have to do with your group activity and research. So everything is important as we share this journey together on this course, and I'm incredibly excited to get together and talk about our ideas about the meaning of social narrative, about place and space and museums. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'll see you soon.